District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. I've had several people reach out to me about some of the cost cutting that is occurring at the various agencies relating to Department of Interior, U.S. Agriculture, which houses the Forest Service, and all the derivative departments. Someone I brought on today, friend of the show, I think will help us break down exactly what is happening with these cost-cutting measures. And perhaps we can reassure you all listening that conservation funding is not going to be imperiled, but there have to be some costs perhaps needed to ensure that conservation works as intended. We brought back Zack Vucurevich of Whetstone Habitat, and Zack actually worked for the Forest Service years ago. He's also worked, I believe, for various different states. He worked for the West Virginia DNR too. So he has experience, and he has a perspective maybe that even some other employees of the federal agencies and state wildlife agencies also share. So Zack, thank you for coming on. I was really impressed and interested to have you talk about this because of the newsletter you sent out about cost-cutting measures. So what prompted you to write your newsletter? And then can you briefly go over what you wrote and what some of the sentiments are from some workers from these agencies?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, thank you for having me on, Gabby. This was a topic I wanted to pick up actually as a rebuttal to an article I saw the other day that was a sob story about one of these employees that got let go from the Forest Service. And it sucks. Every single one of these land managers that gets let go, there's going to be a backlog of work and stuff that's going to accumulate. But pardon my pun, people are having a hard time seeing the forest from the trees. Like, we need to realize as a nation, we're not in a good spot financially. We're $74 trillion in debt. We have to make some tough decisions. And looking at what this previous administration left over for these natural resource agencies, there really wasn't much of a choice. And, it's funny, all these other budget cuts going on. We're hooting and hollering and whooping and cheering. You hear about USAID, people talking about abolishing the IRS, the Department of Education. Everyone's all excited about all that stuff. But as soon as these cuts come to, our favorite agency, we're up in arms and we feel like we're being attacked. And I just don't think that's the case. As you said, I was a former Forest Service employee. I was one of these 1099 employees. A lot of these people that got laid off were 1099 or traditionally 1039 employees. These 1039 employees are seasonal employees. That's the 1039 stands for 1,039 hours. It's 1 hour less than being a full time, more than half the year. So traditionally, these agencies, that's how they got a lot of this work done during their busy season. They'd bring on these seasonal employees that come in, that work their butts off. That's what I did. I was working at the Lincoln National Forest in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and Guadalupe Ranger District. And I wish I was getting paid better while I was out there, but I knew exactly what I signed up for. It was a seasonal job. It was to gain experience. And if I make the right connections, I'll come back the next year, maybe apply for a full-time job somewhere. But somewhere along the road, it turned into, well, we need to retain these employees and we need to make sure that they come back. So let's give them some extra, benefits and guarantees and kind of sweeten the pot during the off season so we make sure we're keeping them happy. It doesn't sit well with me as a taxpayer. So yeah, I've just seen a lot of stuff on social media lately about these cuts, especially with regard to the Forest Service. And I think, like I was saying earlier, as soon as they come after your favorite little pet agency, you feel like it's personal. And I'm just trying to get people to take a step back and just understand the situation we're in and what got us here and how we plan on, mitigating this moving forward.
Like correction, the national debt right now is about 36 trillion, but if we're not careful, it could balloon to that, I don't know, maybe within 5 to 10 years. But I hope people are serious about tackling the debt. But you raised some good concerns because, the the American people did elect this administration to do some cost-cutting measures. And every agency, including our favorite agencies that we like and that we hope to see a balanced mission statement restored at, they're going to get some budget cuts as well. I don't think you're going to see money that is congressionally appropriated, which a lot of people don't know how to make the distinction between wasteful spending at agencies and mandatory spending that is appropriated to the agencies for all the critical projects. So anything that Congress appropriates for Pittman Robertson, Dingell Johnson, sustaining the different things, those monies are not going to be going anywhere. That's what people have to, that's what they have to understand. So anything that Congress has funded, you're going to see those monies remain. So that doesn't mean, and that also doesn't mean there's going to be a wholesale transfer of public lands to states or so-called private entities. And I don't think you and I agree with that sentiment either. I think what the middle ground for that issue would be multiple use management. And we have people, and including some nominees to BLM and some other places, that are going to restore that philosophy. So everyone gets happy. You make sure those lands are working lands, including for recreation and whatnot. So the freezing and the potential cost cutting doesn't necessarily lead to a radical thing like the wholesale transfer of land. I hope it doesn't. I don't think it does. But critical programs, I talked to Mark Oliva from the NSSF, and he told me that anything appropriated for conservation funding is not being touched because President Trump in the first administration kept that money there. I think what the root cause of this, Zach, and we were talking about this before going online, I don't think a lot of people who are very, I would say, alarmed by the costs, or maybe they're not reading so much into it. I would say accounts like, alternate national parks. That's kind of a preservationist outfit, and I would not trust that outfit very seriously because they're ginning up people. They have millions of followers and they've done a great job of getting people's attention, but they're kind of like a resistance force within these agencies, especially NPS. They tend to be more progressive in nature. They're really gung-ho about the climate activism. So I would be careful. I want to caution listeners and anyone listening about this to really take what they're saying with a grain of salt, knowing what their politics are with that. And then it doesn't help that some in the media are echoing what they're saying. So you have that, you have them heightening fears. But no critical funding so far has been touched from my understanding. And I think if that does happen, people will raise the alarms. It's just a matter of looking to see if there's any fraud, waste, and abuse. For Department of Energy and EPA, there has been noticeable fraud and abuse. I think there's also going to be, as it relates to Department of Energy or Department of Interior, Fish and Wildlife. We've spoken to some people who have uncovered eco-grief counseling sessions, which has nothing to do with the mission statement of Fish and Wildlife Service. We will probably see some gutting of climate specific programs that had no bearing to increasing access or enhancing access on national wildlife refuges, things of that sort. Or we probably will have seen some sort of ESG DEI thing to encourage people to go to the outdoors, which that's debatable if that actually does lead to more people participating in these activities. So you will see some sunlight shined on and scrutinized on the traditionally less controversial entities and agencies. But I would say the problem with this, why we're seeing so many people, the reports about like there's one master key lock specialist at Yosemite. Certain Park Service employees are holding down an upside down flag. But when other people do that, I'm not justifying you do that, but it's a symbol of the country being in distress. I don't have an opinion one way or another, but when someone else does it, it's wrong and against democracy. But if Park Service employees, rogue Park Service employees do this, not all Park Service employees are engaging in what we're being told is malicious compliance. So they're complying with the directives to assess and look to see about cross-cutting measures, but they're doing it to enact more pain. I would say the root cause of this, I know this is long-winded, Zach, but my point with this is, and to ask you about this, is a lot of people don't know that there are these extraneous programs, but President Biden, with respect to the National Park Service, increased the maintenance park backlog by $9 billion after the Great American Outdoors Act passed in 2020. And it's set to expire. B, right? Yeah, billion with a B. And this is $9 billion. Yeah, and Great American Outdoors Act is set to expire, according to PERC, this year. I thought it was supposed to be permanent, but I guess it has to be reauthorized, every 5 years. But it doesn't mean that every year money has to be appropriated for maintenance backlog. So when you know that, when something as simple as maintaining the parks, improving infrastructure, making sure you have enough employees, but yet it's shown to be in reality that $9 billion somehow it ballooned to that. Why wasn't there any maintenance of the parks done across the last 4 years? Why were there few people working numerous jobs? I think that's more of a problem to me than temporary freezing.
Yeah, well, exactly. And what really bothers me about this whole thing is when you're looking at like these employees, for instance, that were laid off in the Forest Service, 3,400 employees. It's about 10% of the workforce. There was, I'd say, about half of those employees, between 1,300 and 1,400 of those employees were on their probationary period, becoming a full-time employee. What the Biden administration was trying to do was trying to take these 1039 employees and extend them to be this full-time seasonal work. And they were still in that probationary period. They weren't even locked in. And to the kicker to that was that Biden guaranteed all these jobs, but he didn't appropriate the funding for it. Congress never provided funding to maintain these positions for an extended period of time. And so this was a train wreck getting ready to happen. The money just wasn't there. And the further and further we get from this multiple use, sustainable mandate, these agencies are supposed to be self-funding. And then I go on and I'm doing some homework yesterday and I find out, not only have we not been cutting any timber off our national parks, but we imported over $10 billion worth of timber from Canada last year.
You're kidding.
None of this is. No. Let me find it here in my article. I think it was 11.5 billion worth of wood products from Canada last year.
I do see that. That's interesting. Explain more about that, please.
So my point is, when you talk about managing forests, there's been this overarching theme where people, you go back to the spotted owl, where you can't cut any trees because you got to save the owl. People get this misconstrued thing where timber harvests are somehow this naughty thing, and then it gets looped into this whole climate change agenda. Why would you cut a tree down? Well, the reason we cut trees down is a great way to sequester carbon. Is one. So when you cut a tree down, there's going to be a new forest that grows back. As those trees grow, they go through photosynthesis. They're taking carbon dioxide out of the air. They're releasing oxygen, making water, and making wood. It's almost entirely carbon. This cycle is a great way. You're taking that carbon off of the landscape that traditionally we haven't been harvesting. We've been leaving these mismanaged woodlots out there to rot. And then all of a sudden a forest fire happens and you don't sequester any of that carbon. It just gets released right back into the atmosphere. So you have to foot the bill for fighting these forest fires. You're losing out on the income from the forest fires. And all the while, we're just relying on the timber industry up in Canada to fill the gap for us. It's like, why wouldn't we take the initiative to start managing our woodlots better, start gaining some revenue for these agencies to be able to provide for the employees that they need to keep a functioning park? And then on top of that, you look at where's the best hunting on a national forest? It's either an area that recently burned or an area that's been cut recently. These game species especially really like those disturbed sites in a variety of habitat types on the landscape. And if you're not cutting trees, you're just kind of waiting on a lightning strike or a catastrophe to happen in order to, part the seas of this mediocre rundown habitat and give it a chance after a catastrophic fire to regenerate. It's not a very sustainable game plan. And there's a better way. You look at the mission statements for these natural resource agencies, and it says right there in them, there's supposed to be multiple use. We're supposed to be extracting resources in a sustainable manner that provides both recreating opportunities and funding for the agencies themselves. So I think we've kind of veered away from that overarching theme of these agencies, and we're paying for it on the back end.
So you write here in your newsletter, and it's also available online, and I will link to it in the show notes. So Biden had increased the number of temporary workers who are not supposed to be, if you said they're kind of like a 1099 or 1039 category. So they're not supposed to be getting increased pay, health insurance, retired benefits, because that would mean they'd have to be full-time employees. But some of these workers you mentioned who work 6 months gigs are only supposed to be on a temporary basis. So, of course, he wanted to expand the federal workforce. And I did not realize it came from the Infrastructure Act and the IRA. Of course,
it's that inflation reduction, right?
Yeah. I mean, because there's so many things tied to these big spending bills that people don't know. And I understand why some people are upset. They haven't read between the lines about this. But I think something I want to say to reassure, it's not because we're callous or we're celebrating anything. And I'm not. I'm just wanting to assess why this is happening, why we may not have to put the 5 alarm bells quite yet. Because I think through this whole process with DOGE, and I'm not an apologist for DOGE. I think there's some great things. Some things of it haven't worked as intended quite yet. But from what I understand and preen and glean from the efforts so far, they have said themselves, including Elon Musk, who's been instrumental in this, that if they make mistakes, they will reassess any firings and bring back those people. This was the case with a couple of nuclear engineers and scientists. So if they find that they had accidentally or too swiftly fired people who are essential at the Forest Service, BLM, greater DOI, all these different agencies, my understanding is they'll bring those people back. And I think if that does happen, they will say, okay, maybe we were a little too, much operating like a chainsaw with these firings, and we have to be a little more judicious. So I think some people will be brought back if they were mistakenly fired. And we'll see, if there are going to be some legal challenges with respect to these particular agencies, if these layoffs hold, and what some of these secretaries have to say about that as well. So I want to kind of reassure people that mistakes do happen in these kinds of things. Some people may not like the swift approach that is occurring, where I'm kind of in a wait and see period to see what is happening. And again, it's not to be callous or, to be, gleeful over what is occurring, because cuts do need to be cuts do need to occur in this scenario. Does it mean everything has to be eliminated? No. I think essential stuff will remain, but it remains to be seen what is going to be cut. There's a lot of things moving fast. It's hard to know what information is accurate and what's not accurate. And I think just waiting and seeing what happens is going to be essential. And then you write in your newsletter that about the private sector. So some tough love for people, maybe former coworkers of yours or people who were in your position. So what do you encourage those who may have been laid off? What do they need to do? And what does the public need to understand from this?
So this is something I think a lot of the public doesn't understand to begin with. But traditionally, especially, so I worked for the Forest Service, I think it was 2016 going into 2017. Most of the work being done on the national forest is contracted out, whether it's road maintenance, whether it's putting fences in, a lot of the bathrooms were upkeep. They would contract that kind of stuff out. We even have contracted archaeologists. We have archaeologists on staff with the Forest Service, but we would contract out archaeologists to come out and do all these surveys. It makes a lot more sense from a business perspective. If you just need a survey done or something, why would you have a full-time employee on staff ready to go do one particular type of survey, say a bat survey or something, when you can just go out and contract somebody that's already paying the insurance on their employees, already has them trained, why wouldn't you contract that kind of stuff out? It's a much more practical approach for these agencies to be able to do that. And they don't have the burden of having to train and keep all of these, people on staff that have, whether it's specific jobs or skill sets. I just think going to the private sector, and I was in this position. I didn't get fired from the Forest Service. I was working, as I said, as a seasonal employee. And as you brought up, I worked for state agencies. I worked for a ranch at one point down in Texas, a game ranch. I worked for nonprofits. I've done just about everything in the natural resource space. But at the end of the day, when I was getting towards the end of my, career in the public service department, it was the bureaucracy that I was running into where you couldn't get anything done. So perfect example on the National Park Service, if we wanted to go do construction on a fence, let's say a fire went through and it burned down a fence and we wanted to hire a crew to go out there and re-put that barbed wire fence back up. We would first have to call in a plant surveyor, have them go out there. Oftentimes that was part of my job. I'd go out and I'd look for the Unzler hedgehog cactus. I'd go out and do a cactus survey. Then they'd send out archaeologists. They got to send archaeologists out there to make sure that you're not running anything over when you get the equipment out there. And next thing you know, you're 2 years down the road before you can get a stupid fence put up on the national forest. And it's just all of this red tape and frustration I was facing when I would see an issue on the landscape and try to address it. And, no, we got to fill out a form and we got to wait for approval and then we can go do it. I got awfully sick of that. And talking about the private sector, I remember my supervisor actually mentioned him in this article because he's a current Forest Service employee. But when I was working as an intern for him down in with the West Virginia DNR, he had brought up, the private sector in terms of natural resource workers. I didn't know what a habitat consultant was at the time, but it piqued my interest, and I started doing a little homework on it. And I was still in college when that conversation occurred. But throughout my career, as I'm working at all these different agencies and working in the private sector and nonprofit, I came to realize that the latitude you get working in the private sector to be able to go out, work directly with landowners. I still have to follow burn protocols. Yeah, I got it. There's still rules, but there's not all that red tape. So if you're one of these land managers that was recently laid off, my heart goes out to you. But you have to realize if your heart is in this for making a big impact on the landscape, there's no better place to do it than the private sector. You got landowners willing to pay you to do this kind of work. They're eager to do it. And most of the time, you're not sitting there waiting on an approval process from 10 different agencies or NGO groups that need to get in there and approve of something before it gets done. So it's important to realize. Now, that said, if you're starting your own business, you got your own things you got to figure out. You got to get your own insurance. You got to get your LLC. You got to learn how to market. You got to do the whole gamut of that kind of stuff. But there's plenty of companies popping up that are doing this kind of contracting work, whether it's trails work, whether it's, wildlife surveys. There is a market for this kind of stuff. And I think it can be a win-win situation for both these natural resource workers and these agencies themselves, so they can start restructuring and relying more heavily on the private sector for this kind of stuff.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I know, like I said, as the kinks work out, I think things are going to be fine. The funding that is critical for the conservation projects that we all enjoy and take advantage of, including access and what have you, those should not be affected. And once these temporary freezing measures are taken off, I think all will be fine. I spoke to someone recently at Department of Interior. They said it's just a lot going on right now. And they said that, yes, things will be back to normal. We're going to hire more people. It's going to be fine. Just trust us, trust the process. This happens with every administration. Especially something a little different, of course, is they're trying to make sure that federal monies are being stewarded and that the agencies are going to be working as intended. So I think, like I said, it's a wait and see period. I know some people are probably hurting. It's horrible to lose a job. I've lost jobs. I've been fired from jobs. And a lot of federal workers have sadly been shielded from that. So you're going to feel like what a lot of us have felt in the private sector or nonprofit space. And it's not fun, but it makes you stronger. Adversity helps you become a better person, could maybe lead you to your best career ever through self-employment or something of that nature. Or maybe you'll get back into the public sector. But it's not an end all be all. It may suck, but maybe it could be an opening for people to explore, obviously, conservation adjacent careers elsewhere. But this happens in the private sector. I think the public sector, unfortunately, has to experience this because no job should ever be permanent, unless if it's very specialized, very needed, and someone, if you don't have someone who meets the criteria for that, there are certain exceptions, of course. But I think that's why people have just grown distrustful of the bureaucracy. And when the bureaucracy operates without any accountability, you see all this crazy funding that undermines hunting, or policies that are implemented that discourage fishing, hunting, multiple uses. So I think they're trying to do a course correction. Will it work? Let's hope, and restore some balance there. But Zach, what else are you working on briefly, and direct people to learn about your consulting business, please?
Yeah. So my business, Whetstone Habitat, I do private property evaluations and habitat management plans for private landowners. So I help people manage their properties in a way that's more sustainable and more in line with the hunting and fishing aspects of how they're trying to manage their property. So I like to get in there. I'm very passionate about, native grasslands, invasive species mitigation, and everything I really do is about helping landowners get the most out of their property. I like educating people on how to be better stewards of their land. So I go out, work directly with landowners. I'll write up a blueprint for them. Hey, this is how I would manage your property with those goals in mind, whether it's, more deer on the landscape, bigger deer, trying to restore the quail populations. It's a really great career. It gives me a lot of freedom. I'm pitching to all these 3,400 employees that just got laid off. But it's a really exciting job. This is my busy time of year. I just got back from West Virginia a couple of weeks ago. I had a few management plans out there. I got one coming up in Tennessee. And it's just a super exciting time to be in this space. It was pretty slow. The market was kind of held up here with people anxious about the election towards the end of last year and what the economy was doing and where we were heading. And I'll tell you, ever since November, business has been picking up. People are a little more willing to be optimistic and spend a little money and, get what needs to be done on their properties rolling. It's a great time to work in the natural resource industry. And if you want to follow along, it's Whetstone Habitat, WHETSTONE Habitat. You can find me Instagram, YouTube. My newsletter, Whetstone Weekly, is what we've been referring to here. So you can find the links to that on any of my social media pages.
Fabulous. As always, I'll include everything in the show notes. It's an interesting debate. We may get some angry feedback from people, maybe some friends of ours. But I think it's a level-headed thing to talk about. Like I said, I'm not celebrating anyone losing jobs, and I think it's terrible. I had someone message me and I didn't know how to respond to them. I've never heard of the individual. He could have said he's a fan of the show, but maybe he isn't. I'm not sure. It's some kind of obscure person. I'm not sure who it is. Never heard from them before, but they had lost their job in the Forest Service in the areas impacted by the flooding. I wasn't familiar with the name, but it's unfortunate. But I can't help. It's really hard to get to the government. Like I can't promise, especially people I don't know, any help or relief. Especially when my contacts into the administration are very slim right now. But like I said, I hope that anyone who was perhaps mistakenly fired, they're brought back on. But this is going to be happening. And unless judges, crack down on this and say this is illegal, most of the rulings so far for shrinking or reforming the agencies actually been in the favor of the Trump administration, because they do have the authority, to my understanding, to restructure the bureaucracy as needed, because that's under the purview of the executive branch. And so, yes, it's going to be a lot of growing pains. Some things we may not like, but does it affect overall conservation funding? I don't think that's going to happen. And if it does, I will be critical if something, really egregious occurs. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're just trying to course correct from the past administration, and hopefully it works with the strategy. And and if any mistakes are made, I think they will course correct and fix.
Yeah. And I think we need to realize that we need to go fast. We need to cut the fat. We need to. This is all, like, I was talking to my former supervisor that works for the Forest Service, and I asked him, how are you feeling about this? He's like, everyone in my office is anxious. Nobody knows. There's people thinking about taking the government buyout, but they're not sure because they're a couple months away from retirement, and how's that going to fall in? And there's all these questions in the air. And but you personally, knowing that you might not have a job here in a couple of weeks, how do you feel about the whole thing? And to his credit, he said, it'd suck if I lost my job, but looking at the bigger picture, it's something that needs to happen. And coming from a current Forest Service employee, I was happy to hear there are some people in there that can't see the forest through the trees.
That's very interesting perspective. So even people on the inside understand that certain improvements have to occur. There will be some sacrifices made, and hopefully it'll lead to more efficiency and the agencies working well and better, in fact, because like I said, we've had this maintenance backlog, $9 billion. We've seen programs and grants put out there that have nothing to do with forest management. It's some weird woke adjacent program to help people outside of America, tangentially related to forest management or conservation, but has no bearing to our efforts. So I think certain things are going to be not, preferred or popular in the beginning. Hopefully in the long run, some of these improvements or adjustments for efficiency help keep and steer the agencies back to their mission statement. Like I said, I'm a wait and see kind of person. And I said, if anything problematic occurs, I will be the first person to sound the alarms and be like, hey, we actually need this. Let's not cut here. Cut where it's wasteful, cut where it's not efficient, cut where it's problematic. So, Zack, this has been great to deconstruct with you. Thank you so much. And I think people should read your newsletter, especially the internet version, with an open mind, and understand that not every person speaking out is against what's happening, and that even people on the inside might be sympathetic to the overall goal of making even these agencies more efficient. So thank you again for coming on and catching up with me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Gabby.
If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.